and this rock and this house have to do with Wilmington's history? Well, they all at one point in time had something to do with the Harnden family of Wilmington. 5. The first white man to settle in Wilmington was Richard Harnden, an Englishman who had settled in the area after his father had moved from Braintree. He settled in a little town called Nod, which was sandwiched in between Reading and Billerica, which is now, of course, called Wilmington. Richard owned the land from Lubbock Creek to about where Salem Street is located now, and he built his house on High Street. His son, John, later, about 30 or 40 years later, built his own house behind his father's, about 100 or so yards behind it. But back in the 1700s, early 1700s, the French and English became involved in Queen Anne's War. The French began to incite the Indians in the area to kill off English settlers. But it was during that time in 1706 that the youngest son of Richard Harnden, Benjamin, was on his way home from Woburn on the Boston and Andover Road. He accidentally killed a drunken squaw who was sleeping in the middle of the street. The French had found out what happened and told the Indians in the area, who swore to avenge the squaw's death. So one night the Indians came down looking for Benjamin Harnden and stopped at Richard Harden's house, only to find no one there. They then proceeded on to John's house, which was located a few hundred yards behind Richard's. There they chopped a hole in the ceiling and fell through, killing Mrs. John Harnden and 3 of her 7 children. The remaining 4 children ran out behind this rock. Later on that evening, the Indians found the 4 remaining children huddled behind the rock. They then proceeded to kidnap the children and take them back to their camp. The next morning, other English settlers in the area found out what had happened at the Harnden house the night before, and they got together a small party to rescue the children. They successfully did that later on that afternoon. The house that was broken into by the Indians remained unlived in for 50 years. Out of the 4 children that was there, the youngest was John Harnden, whose grandson is better known as Colonel Joshua Harnden, who owned the Harnden Tavern in North Wilmington. Today we're standing outside the Harnden Tavern, and I'm here with Josh Rennan, who actually lives here in the Harnden Tavern with his wife Lisa. Exactly, Josh, how did you get around to owning the house and actually living in it?
Well, me and my wife Lisa lives here in Wilmington close by, and I didn't live here. And before we got married and I'd come visiting out this way, we always took walks in the health center trail, which goes around out back of the property. And we always came into the back fields here, which is part of the tavern property. And we just fell in love with the house because of the antiquity of it and the beauty of the grounds. And we'd have a lot of picnics out back. And we had found out through Lisa's parents that people did actually live in the house. And so then we found out later on, about the time we were going to get married, which hasn't even been a year yet, that the people in the house were moving out. And so we were looking for an apartment at that time. So we got in touch with the town, and the town told us, yes, come down and fill out applications. We're looking for new tenants. And so we filled out applications, and it was very much our good fortune that we were the ones that were chosen to be the new tenants. And I think one of the reasons we were chosen because we really expressed to them that we just didn't need an apartment, and we wanted to just live in any place that if we could live in this place, we would really take care of it because we love the grounds and we love just the beauty of the history of the house itself.
So, what a lot of people don't know is that the Harnden Tavern is actually open for tours and visitors. And the first Sunday of every month we have an open house from 2 to 4.
Exactly. With our lease, there came some responsibilities. One of the responsibilities was having the house open for an open house, the tavern part of the house open for tours on the first Sunday every month. So it is open the first Sunday of every month. As well as that, there are 2 groups involved with our Harnden Tavern. There is the Wilmington Historical Commission, which oversees the house and the actions that are done on it, as far as the keeping up of the grounds and and the inside of the house. The actions that happen on the property itself, they oversee that. Then there's another group called the Friends of the Harnden Tavern, and they're volunteer people who just enjoy the house, and they love what me and Lisa fell in love with, the beauty of the house, and they're interested in keeping up the house. So they gather monies through different festivals to buy furniture for the house, to try to restore it to the way it was. And so they hold different festivals, one of which is the Strawberry Festival, which will be in two weeks, June 17th. And they also hold a Christmas social and a flea market, which is usually run at the same time as a apple festival, a fall festival, and that's of course in the autumn. And so there's various things that they run to try to get up some money so that they can restore the house to the way it was.
Well, since we're standing outside, why don't we go inside and take a look?
Okay, but before we go inside,
Okay.
why don't I tell you a little bit about just the history of the house. The history of the house, where we are staying, the first thing I try to do on a tour is to get the people's minds set back in the time period that it was, which this was whole country at that time, or the part that was settled anyway, was still under rule of the king. And so this area here was called, the English called the Land of Goshen, which was basically North Wilmington. Or actually this was called the Land of Nod, where we are here in North Wilmington. More towards the center of town was called the Land of Goshen. And then there was another area in the bogs that was called Boggy Meadows. So that's the way the English had called the different sections of Wilmington. This property was called Lot 1 in the Land of Nod, as we are here. It was owned by a judge, Samuel Sewell, who was one of the 3 judges on the witch trials. Well, he had owned the land till about 1726 when he died, and it was bought by Samuel Drummer. At that time, Samuel Drummer bought this land and built a house about 500 yards over, more towards the Regional Health Center. That house was burnt down by fire in about 1738. And Samuel Drummer was quite a prominent citizen of Wilmington. He was the first town moderator, and he was a very active citizen in the town. And so he then sold the land to, when he had died, the land was acquired by a Captain Ebenezer Jones. And it was Captain Ebenezer Jones, his son, Jacob, who knew Colonel Joshua Harnden and actually built him this house here where we stand. And so this became Joshua Harnden's house, and he later turned it into a tavern, so that's why it's called the Colonel Joshua Harnden Tavern. A lot of old houses, they don't know exactly when they were built. The deeds don't go back that far. So the way they come to know about when they were built is through the architectural features of the house. And this genteel molding here, as well as up under what is now the gutter, that is a definite feature of what is called the late Georgian architecture. There are other features of the house, like the cedar shingling, as well as other features within the house that show that this was a late Georgian house, and those were all built about the late 1770s. So that's the date they have for the tavern being built. There's a part in which we live as the innkeepers over towards that side of the house, which was built about 100 years later in the 1870s, and so that was built later on. But that 1770 is the date they give for when the house was built. And if we'd like to go inside now, we could begin the tour. This is the actual grog room. This is what makes the Harnden Tavern a tavern. A grog room is where the actual drinking went down. Okay? This house, as I explained out there, was built in 1770, but it actually began to be a tavern until 1794. See, what had happened is Colonel Joshua Harnden became a very upstanding and very looked to man in the American Revolution. He actually took on the rank of a colonel, Colonel Joshua Harnden. And when he returned from the Revolutionary War, they still had 3 daughters living at home. And he retired from the army and decided to, how was he going to make money? And he decided to turn his house into a tavern. And so here we are in the grog room. A little more about Colonel Joshua Harnden is that he became a very famous person in the town of Wilmington, or in its early history. He was one of the early selectmen of the town, and also he was one of the 3 men sent from the town to draw up the Massachusetts state constitution. After the states had become free, the colonists, they all wrote up their state constitutions, and the towns sent 3 people, and Joshua Harnden was one of the 3 that went to help write this up. So anyway, getting back to the story, as the story goes, he had 3 daughters still living here, so he decided to turn it into a tavern. And so this was the room that made it a tavern, the grog room. This is where, as we said before, the drinking went on. And the first thing is that there were no women allowed. So there could be some funny stuff going on here today with a woman in our presence, but actually, no, that was a rule then. And the tavern was a very vital thing in those days because there were no newspapers, of course, and not only did the men come around to drink and whoop it up, but they also to spread the news, to learn the latest news of not only the local community, but of the world abroad. And so in here was served hard cider and rum being the import, and cider being the early form of, actually hard cider, which is just cider that is fermented, being the early American first whiskey at that time. And so, in the tavern, we have certain features which, again, relate back to that Georgian architecture. And one of them is the pine paneling we have here. Pine paneling at that time was very much a show of wealth. And so, Colonel Joshua Harnden, being a wealthy man, paneled the tavern, the grog room here from top to bottom, which was very much a show of wealth at that time. And over here we have this Franklin fireplace, which was actually put in later. It was invented by Ben Franklin, and it was put in when a Dr. Silas Brown owned the house. It wasn't put in by Joshua Harnden, but again, this was a show of wealth of these later days. Invented by Ben Franklin, and the main feature of the fireplace was, now it's bricked in, as many of the fireplaces are in the house, which again, the fireplace was a sign of the late Georgian architecture. It has a central chimney coming down the middle of the house, and in each room, there are 8 fireplaces, one for each room, that go off into the main chimney, and all the smoke then went up through like that. Well, the main feature of the Franklin fireplace was it had a curved back, and the metal, which retained the heat better than the bricks did, and it threw the heat back out into the room. Some of the other things I point out to people on the tour is this little item right here. And I always have the kids, well, even the grown-ups have a hard time guessing it. Maybe you'd like to even guess what this may have been used for? Put you on the spot here.
For keeping cold food and things like that?
Yes, and as you can see, it had a handle. What this really was a very early space heater. At that time, of course, they had carriages, so they didn't have cars. They didn't have cars with heaters, and so they would take some of the coals, put them in here, and you would keep this at your feet in the carriage as you went off to the meeting house, which at that time was the First Congregational Church in town, and you would leave these by your feet at the pews, and that was the way they kept warm in those days. This other thing we have here is exactly what it looks like, and that's to take your boots off. Of course, at that time, everyone wore boots because most rode horses, and there was no asphalt. There was just the roads, which became very muddy, as roads still do these days. And mothers, being the way they were those days, the same way, didn't want mud tracked all over the house, so the boot, this thing, item here to take your boots off was a very common thing in the house. Okay, now we move over here to a closet. And closet at that time was not a very common thing, as they are in today's houses. One of the reasons was because the British, as I've given this tour, I also try to get people's minds set in the idea of why did the colonists revolt? Why was there the Revolutionary War? Well, it was because the English basically, as I've come to understand, just used the colonists for a source of income to send back to England.
Right.
They took the resources of the land, which they had pretty much depleted in their own home country of England, cut down most of the trees. So they took our trees, our resources, as well as a lot of the money through taxation. Of course, one of the final acts was the Boston Tea Party, where they started taxing the tea. Well, in this house, we'll see a couple other items that they taxed, and you begin to see what the American colonists, what the anger they started to build up on having to be ruled by a king that they never saw, and to send him money for just basic household things. One of which is a closet. You were just taxed on any closet size you had in your house. Some of the things you see in the house, you could have a certain size, and then over that you were taxed. All closet space was taxed. So it was, again, a show of wealth to have a closet in your house because you paid taxes on it. Another reason you may not have a closet in your house was because, as closets even do today, they take up a lot of the heat. So you try to keep your house as warm as possible, and with closets really took a lot of the heat and pushed back out a lot of the cold. So that's why you didn't see too many closets in that time. So moving to here, we have an original tavern table. This didn't come with the house. It was not found here. So we can't say that this may have stood in this very room as it did back in the 1780s, but this was a tavern table of that period, as well as these tables being tavern tables that would go around such a table as this. Here we have a replica of the type of lighting that they had back then, which of course was all candles. And the Friends of the Harnden Tavern, in raising the money as they do, have sent away and had these specially made of the certain time period that these would have been. So, and in that time period, they would have been made of tin, which was the metal that was often used back then. Tin also became one of the elements that was used in pewter at that time period, which was another often used material. And so you get an idea of the source of lighting that was used back then. And so there we have the grog room, and now we'll proceed forth and continue on the tour. First thing I always point out here is the front door. The thing about the front door is the door itself is not the original door, but what is original is the hinge, door hinges, which you get an idea of the size. They go basically across the whole door, and the size of the lock, and the size of the key, which I use to open that massive lock. So, anyway, why have such a lock? Yes?
The Indian problem that they had.
There we go. And another thing is to try to get the people on the tour to, again, go back in time to realize that the Indians were not only out in the good old American West, where the cowboys were, they were right here where the early settlers were. The East Coast was very much inhabited by many different Indian tribes. And except for 3 people.
Bringing the children, one of them being Joshua Harnden's grandfather.
Joshua Harnden's father, no, grandfather. Okay, so, right, so the house that was under attack was Joshua Harnden's great-grandfather. And his grandfather was one of the ones that escaped. So it was through his escaping that we eventually had Colonel Joshua Harnden in the lineage there. So that gives you an idea that Indian massacres, again, did not happen only on the Great Plains, but they happened right here at home. Okay, some of the other features in the main hallway here is, again, this replica of the way they would have lit a front hallway at that time. Again, 3 candles with this brass lantern fitting. Again, that was purchased by the Friends of Harnden Tavern and trying to bring the house back into the time period of that time. Over here we have an item. It is not an historical item, but it shows that this is a historical place, and this is truly a great thing. This house is on the National Register of Historic Places, and it is just a great honor that this has happened, because with the value placed on property these days, as we all see, the development goes on, a lot of old houses are unfortunately torn down. And back in 1972, I believe it was, they passed the federal act that was the Eminent Domain Act for Natural Historic Places, which means a town could now take a property through eminent domain for the sake of restoring that historical place. And it was that act that the town used in 1975 to take this house from a developer who had bought the land and was about to just level this place. So that is not an historical piece of writing there, but it is a very needed one, and it shows how this house came about today. And behind you we have the secret room, which is when I give a tour, all the kids love to come. But unfortunately, you people watching this will not be able to go in here because it's so dark, and I don't believe the camera is going to be able to go in there. So maybe this will intrigue you to come and check out the secret room. The secret room the history behind that is that some of you hopefully have heard of the Underground Railroad. And what that was, this is after Joshua Harnden owned the house, and now Dr. Silas Brown owned the house. Actually, the Brown family owned the house for the longest time period the house was ever owned. For about 125 years, I know it was 125 years, and it was from about the 1800s right up until about 1907 you owned the house. So, Dr. Silas Brown was both a doctor and a farmer. And one of his daughters married a person by the name of Harnden Colburn. And Harnden Colburn was very much associated with a group out in Concord called the Free Thinkers. Some of the other people in that group was the poet Ralph Waldo Emerson and David Henry Thoreau, people like that. They were called Free Thinkers, and one of their things that they promoted or were for was the abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement set up the Underground Railroad, which of course was not a physical railroad, but it was a series of houses that came up from the south to free the slaves. Slaves would move from house to house under the cover of darkness until they got to the north. Well, in getting these tours, one of the things that first crossed my mind, well, once they got to the north, why did they still have to hide? Well, slavery was not recognized in the north, but it was a legality in the United States. So when slaves ran away from the south, they had broken the law, and even in the north, they were still had broken the law. And the U.S. government could send people to reclaim those slaves. So they were still had to hide while they were in the north. Well, in Dr. Silas Brown, and the story goes over very long conversations at night with this Harnden Colburn, eventually agreed to become part of the Underground Railroad. And so in this room, which is just looks like a simple closet, behind there, a door leads into a little room, which actually is within the chimney. Within the open space of that giant chimney I told you about, the slaves would stand whenever would stand and spend the night until they could move on to the next house, and eventually board boats from the East Coast, and they were usually taken to Canada, where they would become free, and hopefully from Canada they would be taken on boats back to their homeland of native Africa. So that's how the story goes there. And hopefully that intrigues you all to come out. Look at the secret room there. Okay, from there, from the front room, now we're going to go into the next room, which the next room being the parlor. And I ask you, what is a parlor?
Is this like a living room?
Like a living room. And whenever I first heard of a parlor, I said, funny, I know what, I've kind of heard of those rooms, but I just don't really see them anymore. I don't know what one is. And it is kind of an older term. And many of the people that give tours, of course, have had parlors and things like that. In my house, we didn't have one. But a parlor was basically your best room of the house. And it was used for special things, wedding receptions and wakes, which I don't mean to say a special thing there, but a different occasion. And so now parlors have become less and less in use as people utilize more rooms of their house. But back then, parlors were actually only used for wedding receptions and for wakes. So actually, this parlor may have gone, although it was the best room in the house, best pieces of furniture, and I'll show you some other more wealthier things in the room, it may have gone unused for a year. The whole year could have gone unused if no one had died or was married. So anyway, some of the things in this parlor here, again, I get back to the pine paneling. Pine paneling, again, getting back to the show of wealth, and as you can see, this whole wall is pine paneled in some big size panels. One of the interesting stories, again, I tell in the tour, is this specific panel, which I don't know if you know that story. It's quite a story. And again, bringing up a theme that I was talking about before is, why did the colonists become so aggressive to the point of starting the Revolutionary War? The taxation. Well, pine paneling was another thing that was taxed. They allowed certain size pine panels, like maybe a smaller one like this was all right. But the reason the British wanted the pine trees was for the mass of their ship. England, again, being an empire at that time, it's hard to think of such a small island country being an empire, but it was, and it was through its shipping. Well, when they leveled their land, used all their mass, pine trees for mass, one of the main exports they took out of here was the pine trees for their ships. And they didn't like the colonists using the pine wood for paneling. And especially when you got to the bigger size panels, because those are the ones they used for the mass of their ships. Well, the bigger the size, the more you got taxed. Like this would probably be taxed. When you got to the big ones, they so much were against the colonists using those, they actually, a certain size was penalized by death. Because that's how much they needed the whole tree. Because the bigger the panel, of course, the bigger the tree it had to be, and those were the ones they wanted to use for the mass of their ships. Well, the story goes, this panel is of that size. And what Joshua Harnden would do, being considered a radical of the time, very much, again, became a colonel in the Revolutionary War, was very adamant against the rule of the king, kind of flirted with disaster and incorporated this in this wall. And as the story goes, when the king's men first would come around, he would cover it with a painting. So that's one of the stories of the Harnden Tavern. And again, another feature of the house, which I haven't pointed out yet, is a feature seen in many old houses, and that is the wide pine floorboards. And within the floorboards, you see nails, which are not the round nails you see of today, which are manufactured, but the square-headed nails, which were made by the blacksmiths of the time. So, that's the parlor. And now we will go into the back room here. Back here, we're in the northwest room. I usually just call it the bathroom. And
Very sir.
interesting story also involved with this room. As you can see, this is not your typical chimney, fireplace that we've seen in the other rooms. This is actually a small hearth which was used for cooking. And in the far back, the camera may not be able to see, is a beehive oven, which was used for baking bread, and which I'll talk about when we get to the keeping room in the next room. But this was an actual hearth, which means this was utilized as a kitchen at one time, or in those days they called them keeping rooms. Well, the story goes is that when Dr. Silas Brown owned the house, and after he had passed away and left it to a son and a daughter, there broke out a family feud. And so they divided the house in half. And actually, upstairs there's a window that was made into a door so that the people who lived on this side of the house could exit through that way, and the people who lived on the other side of the house could exit through the main front door. Okay, and so that's why this became then utilized not as a fireplace, but as remade into a hearth so that they could, this side of the room could also have a kitchen. Up here you see a feature that was added later, which are these doors, which are used to allow, again, in that time they would want to use as much heat as they could, and the heat coming up from the chimney was allowed to escape back out into the room through these larger doors to those doors up there. But otherwise, this is just another smaller room in the house. And on this table here, we have an interesting thing, some things of which I have just seen for the first time. These are items that were bought at the last auction. This gives you an idea of how the tavern works. They were purchased by the Friends of the Harnden Tavern with the money that they raised throughout the year. And they buy items at these auctions in which at old houses, when they have auctions and items are sold, the friends go and find things that were of the time period, or hopefully even maybe at one time were, if the house is an auction in Wilmington, maybe some of the items once were in the Harnden Tavern.
Right.
So here we have a quilt, which I've been told came from that time period. We have a pitcher, which definitely would have been used in a tavern of that time period. One of the things they were looking to buy, and it seems they did find, is a toy from back then. And also this is just a small footstool. And this, I've been told, was also another item that would have been nailed somehow into the front step on the outside of the house, and it was used to take off the boots. So, now I think we'll continue, and we will go right through the back hallway and right into the keeping room, which was the main room of the house. So, here we are in the keeping room, which was their words for kitchen, ours today. One of the reasons it was, I've heard rumored, or probably more than rumored, probably the truth, it makes sense to me, they called it a keeping room was because it kept people in that room. The reason being it was usually the warmest room. And that time again, with the glass that was so thin in those days, and without the insulation we have today, houses were very cold. And it makes me think of every time I see old movies now of like the 1800s and I see them all dressed up, it makes perfect sense why oftentimes they wore suit coats and heavy coats even while they still remained in the house. So, here we are in the keeping room. One of the first things that I always mention about the keeping room is fires were kept going 24 hours in the main hearth of any house. The reason being is that if you've ever gone camping, you know how hard it is to keep up or to start, not necessarily how hard it is to start a fire, but when you get coals built up, coals that you can cook on, that takes a while. So if they just let fires whatever to build the coals back up enough so that they could begin to cook. So it was actually easier just to keep the fire going. And so women would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and they got up at 4 o'clock in the morning to begin to bake the bread and to get the fire back roaring. And there were 3 items in those days that were made every day. The first being bread, which was a staple in their diet at that time. And the second item being made in this mold here, which is candles. There you go. Candles, again, of course, without any electricity. Candles used every day, burning down every day, had to be made. Wax would be poured in here. Wicks would be put in this end, be set out to harden up, and then they just break them out. Third thing that was made every day was butter for the bread. And again, you get an idea now of the items they ate a lot because, again, dealing with the cold, you needed a food that had a real substance to it and a lot of protein. Bread and butter providing, that protein and those carbohydrates to sustain them through the day. And so butter was the third thing that was made every day. Butter would be made in a butter churn, which is just done by pouring the fat from the milk into here and turned. So this would be a good sized butter churn. And over here we have a little smaller butter churn for those smaller families maybe. And the same thing, you would just pour it in the top here and it would be cranked around. Okay, now we turn to the focus of the room, which of course is the main hearth here. Some of the things that you see of this hearth that you didn't see in the other one was this here, which is called a crane. A crane would be used to, as you can just see, just to move food over that would maybe more the idea of what your top burners would be used for in a stove. If you just wanted to cook something quick and then you would push it over the fire, get it hot for a while, and then when you wanted to just let it heat, just stay warm, you'd maybe pull it away. Now the crane is in opposition to what a beehive oven was used for. A beehive oven simply, I've come in my understanding to see that it's basically was the principle of what your stove, your oven part of your stove does. And what does your oven do? It maintains a constant temperature. You set that dial for 350 and you know it's going to be 350. Well, a fire you can't do that because a fire raises and falls and it's a hard thing to keep it at a constant temperature. So the beehive oven, what they do is they take the coals, once they build the coals up, put it back there in the beehive oven and it would maintain basically the same temperature for a long period of time, of which bread and baked beans, which we all know back then, Boston baked beans, beans being another staple because they provided a lot of protein, a lot of carbohydrates to burn up, would be put and baked back there, and it would maintain a even temperature over a long period of time, which your fire wouldn't be able to do. Right here, we have the door of the beehive oven. It's been taken off and placed down here to get a better view of it. But otherwise, that would have been placed over the opening of that beehive oven there. This item here is called a peel. Looks like something you see in a pizza shop, but it's really not. It's called a peel, and it was used to put the bread in and take the bread out. And if you'd like to handle this, you get an idea of it's got some weight to it, and they didn't fool around in those days. And
Not to mention they had a nine pot at the end of it.
oh boy, it would be very heavy. And again, they must have been some pretty hefty people at those times. And a lot of the work that we have done for us today on the stove and things, I've just really come to understand how much almost gets taken for granted these days with what they've had to deal with. And some of the other items, of course, here's your stew pot. And maybe I'll just let you handle this one too. This it's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, they'd be just lifting these things around like nothing. It's made up. Yeah, especially if it's full. It's made out of your cast iron, which of course was something that retain the heat well. So everything here is made out of iron. Here you have your early day fry pan. And all you did is you pushed aside some coals and just set this down with the legs right on the coals. Over here we have your early toaster. And looks funny, but as you can see and imagine, it would have done the trick. It would have been very, very effective. And you just lay the bread there and, of course, toasted it. Something here that I always point out, too, because it really brings out the New England flavor that we never think about. Take a guess what that might be.
The thing that held the coals to keep the bed warm?
No, not that one. See, you never used one of these, because the way I knew what this was, because I used to use one at my house, and it hasn't changed a bit. The design has not changed at all. It's a popcorn popper.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and the American Indians were very much into popcorn, believe it or not. And it seems like a funny thing, but corn itself was something that the Pilgrims was foreign to them. They had brought over many crops that the American Indians had never seen, but one of the crops that the American Indians had to offer at that famous first Thanksgiving was corn. And we think of ourselves how much corn we eat now, but that came from, it was an American native crop. And one of their varieties was popcorn. And the Indians actually ate popcorn and passed it on to the Pilgrims, who invented something like this. I doubt the American Indians did something like this, but it's a popcorn popper. Okay. Now we move over here to this table here. Some of these items that we're also using in the household. And I love this one because I've heard so many attempts to explain what this is from people, and if you'd like to put your bet down on the table here, what this might be. I know, I didn't either. And actually, the people who usually get it are the children on the tours.
It's an apple peeler?
There we go. See that? She
I found
proved me wrong. Exactly. It was an apple, actually apple core. You would take the decor apples, which could be a long job, and you would say, well, I mean, but boy, I mean, I do it, but the thing is, we don't eat as many apples as they did then. Apples were used a lot. They were used not only as a dessert item, like as we think of only apple pies. Apples itself was used as a spice. Oftentimes, the way we use sugar, the natural sugar of apples were substituted in, and they would be used in stews, on meats, everything. So something like an apple core was something we needed. This is the good old mortar and pestle, and this is actually was Dr. Silas Brown's, and actually it was his wife, who was a nurse also at the time. And of course they would crush up their home remedies here, which at that time was a lot of herbal medicine. The early settlers, as I've read, used a lot, it was all plant medicines, a lot of herbal medicines, and so they would crush up a lot of leaves. The story goes, in this house may have been much more famous than we even know, but they can't verify anything. Dr. Silas Brown's wife, one day, because if you can imagine, just trying to, I mean, there's so many plants out there you could use, and you know, you just kind of trying to figure out which one. She actually was crushing up bread one day.
I've heard about that.
You've heard this story. Crushing up bread one day. Why not, you know? And so, crushed up into little tablets. Well, it became a cure-all. And it was fascinating what the things it would do for people. Well, she later remembered crushing the bread up and remembered that it was stale bread. Well, as we know now, penicillin comes from mold. And so she may have, she's not been credited with it, but she may have been one of the first people to come up with penicillin at that time. Some of the other things here, we have these measuring devices. And as you can see, they're very good size. That's because today, because we have loaves of bread at the store, and maybe we make a loaf of bread for the fun of it, they didn't make loaves of bread for the fun of it. They needed it, and they just didn't make one loaf of bread. They'd make a lot at a time. So, of course, their measuring devices would be much bigger than the ones that we use these days. And in this one, we leave a little salt salt was a preservative at the time, without the refrigeration. They came later with the ice houses and used ice, but salt was also a preservative for the meat. So oftentimes the meat they ate was salted meat. And we have this here, which you can probably guess.
Grater.
I love it because some things just don't change, you know. This is a grater, and it looks pretty much like the grater we have right next door in my own little apartment there. Okay. Here we have something else that really can't change in design. We have a flour sifter. And the other interesting item here is down below here. Hope the camera can get. What this is not a cradle. It is called a dough box. And again, they made many loaves of bread at one time, not just one. And so, one of the things you have to do with bread before you bake it, you have to allow the yeast to rise before it's baked. And so you leave the dough near a source of warmth, which would be the fire. So they had a dough box, which they would lay out, whatever, five or six mounds of dough, let it rise before the fire, and then put them in the beehive oven. So, there we have the keeping room. The other interesting item which we have here is this lantern. Again, was purchased and was a duplication of what might have been used, or what was used at that time, and it was again made out of tin and held the candles. We have it raised up above this table, but in those time periods it would have hung down actually only about a foot or two off the table. Another item here we have in the room, we have these lamps here, which of course are your kerosene lamps, which came later, and with this hurricane lantern device, which of course spread the light all the much more. And the other interesting thing I always like is the early lampshades were made out of paper, and the wives would get very creative and cut out little designs on them like that. So that's really it for the keeping room.
Okay.
And I think we'll go upstairs to the last two rooms, and that should be. Okay, here we are in the back stairwell and the upstairs. And this is one of the back rooms in the upstairs. What we have here, this probably would have been one of these smaller bedrooms. We'll see the two master bedrooms as we get into the next two rooms. This would have been one of the smaller bedrooms, probably for when Dr. Silas Brown owned the house, for where the children might have slept. And in here we have a single bed of the time period. And they were all done in a rope design, like this. And what was laid on top was the old feather mattresses. And what these items are here look like primitive dental tools or something. But they were actually used to tighten the bed up, because as someone slept on the bed, rope being what it is, kind of elastic, would tend to slack off for a while. So they put these in here and twisted them, and the beds would tighten up, and then they would tie the knots again. In the cases back there, we get back to something I talked to earlier in the house, which are the relics of the Indians. And those are the arrowheads, the stone axes. These have been collected by Lars Nielsen, who is the
town
crier, right? He owns the town crier, and he has found these, and he has given these to the Harnden Tavern. So, again, I invite you all come and look at the arrowheads and the remains of who were the first people to live in this land, which were the Native American Indians. Okay, now we go into one of the first of the bedrooms. As a tavern, also taverns were inns at the time. We are located on what are two main roads, and at the time were also main roads. 62, called the Old Bedford Road, went from Boston to Bedford. That was your north-south road. Andover Street here goes into Woburn Street, that towns also made an ordinance of the time that there had to be in the four corners of your town, this being a corner of the town of Wilmington, there had to be an inn. So this, I don't know exactly, this was forced to become an inn, but this is a place where an inn would have likely been situated at the time. Now, in the times of when this was an inn, a tavern, there was also a rule which we don't go by still today, and that was men slept on one side of the house and the women slept on the other, and they all slept in one bed. So this is the room where they say the women slept. As an inn, a carriage would pull up, they would eat dinner down in the tavern, eat dinner in the keeping room, and then they would go up to their separate bedrooms. The women would all come up here and sleep in one room. And the men all slept in the other room we're going to be going into. And if you've all read Moby Dick, you know the opening chapter of the description of when he's all of a sudden finds himself sleeping next to a huge Indian who he doesn't even know. And that gives you an idea again of the time period. Over here we have a spinning wheel. Again, you couldn't just run out and buy your yarn. You spun all your yarn yourself from the flocks that you kept. And that's what this would be done here. Over here, slowly coming back around, we have again, one of the fireplaces in every room, closet space that was would be a show of wealth at that time for this house. And we have this dentile molding, which was characteristic of the late Georgian architecture. And up there we have what I said I was going to get back to, which is the mortar of the time period, which would be made of, at that time period, it was made of oyster and mussel shells and horsehair. That was their early cement. And you also get you see these lats that were used as the wall construction. And if you've ever, you can imagine how much work went into building the house, because now lats, well, they don't even have lats, but they used to, and they're all machine made. These were all cut by hand. Tremendous amount of work. So you get a real feeling of the labor that went in just to building a house at that time period.
That's being hung over a copy of the Declaration of Independence.
Right, exactly. Another reminder of the time period and of the revolt and the victory that the colonists won. Okay. Here we are in the last room of the tour, and very fittingly, because this is the most used bedroom of the house. Again, when it was an inn, this would have been the room that all the men slept in. Afterwards, after it wasn't an inn, and Dr. Silas Brown owned it, rooms would be used to bed down the whole family. The whole family slept in one room. And of course, why? Well, you'd want to keep one fire going upstairs. You had your main fire downstairs, but you wanted your other fire upstairs in that bedroom. So you kept everyone in one room, so you didn't have to have too many fires going, and you all retained the heat. Here we have another one of the rope beds, and this one you get a better feel for the tightening up of these tools. Again, the feather mattress. And down here you have what they call a trunnel bed. And again, the children would sleep, everyone slept in one room. And so these trunnel beds pushed under and then pulled back out when you would use them. And I used to think that the kids slept lengthwise, so you might have got 2 or 3 until someone filled me in that they slept across. And one kid's head would be where the other one's feet were, and you could probably get about 6 or 7 kids on one of these things. Okay, something else just in general about this room, as we can feel today, it is the warmest room. One of the ways you can tell old houses from like the 1700s to the 1800s, in the 1700s, they didn't, as in the 1800s, they began to get into the coal burning and things like that, better forms of energy, so they could build the house situated anywhere they wanted to. In the 1700s, without the modern forms of heat, only the wood, they faced their houses towards the south. And that's a good way to tell the age of a house. If it's facing the south, it was probably built back in the 1700s, because that utilizes the southern exposure, which is your warmest exposure. And also you can tell where the main bedroom would have been, because it would have been in the the southeast corner of the house to utilize all that sun flooding into this one room, which makes it so warm on this day. And an interesting note here also of the house, we get into what something that when you live in an old house you get an idea for how the house living going from 1700s to the 1980s goes through all the forms of heat. Here you have the old fireplace, all boarded up with, originally would have started off with wood, and now you have, they've left up here this potbelly stove, which you would have seen, this would have gone into the coal burning. Down in the basement you have, what was the next form? The oil burning, which is the modern way that the tavern is heated. So you have the progressions from the three forms of energy. And so that just about wraps it up.
Well, I really want to thank you, Josh, because this is really enlightening, and it's a shame that a lot of Wilmington citizens just drive by this house and don't really realize what's located inside.
Well,
it's really beautiful.
Yeah, it really is, and I just thank you for the opportunity that I can go through a tour that maybe people will have a greater ability to make available to them and see. And I hope that the news does get out about the tavern, because they, some very good people set this place aside, and it's for the community, and the community really should participate in it. And I hope this opens it up.
The grandson of Joshua Harnden, who owned the tavern in North Wilmington, bought this house from the Thompson family in 1862. The Thompson family built this house approximately in the late 1700s, although the exact date is not known. Henry Harden lived in the house until 1907, when Pop Nielsen, Lars Nielsen's uncle, bought the house and its land for $2,500. They then turned it into a summer boarding house, where many people from Boston came to spend their summers. In those days, people from Boston came to Silver Lake for their summer cottages. As a matter of fact, Silver Lake at this time was known to be one of the very fashionable resorts. Eventually, the Nielsen family sold a lot of their land to be used for St. Dorothy's Church. In 1937, Pop Nielsen died, and the Joyce family took over their home. They eventually sold it to the Papioneses, and eventually the house fell to the Ryle family, who lives here today. This Henry Harden had a second cousin who was older than him. His name was also Henry Harden, but he was the grandson of Benjamin Harden, the brother of Joshua Harden, who owned the tavern in North Wilmington. This cousin, Henry Harden, was involved in the military like many of his predecessors. He quickly rose through the ranks and became Brigadier General, commander of the 1st Wisconsin Cavalry during the Civil War. When the surrender at Appomattox was signed, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederate States of America, fled. General Harnden and about 700 men were sent to capture Jefferson Davis. They later caught Davis with the help of the 4th Michigan Cavalry, who wanted to bring Davis back to Washington. The Michigan Cavalry collected the reward and was honored for capturing Davis. When General Harden was told of the reward, he wanted to set the record straight. It took 2 years, but finally Congress put into legislation a bill that would give the men of the Wisconsin Cavalry recognition for capturing Jefferson Davis. The Hardens settled in the land of Nod. They were present at Wilmington's first town meeting, which is a tradition that is still held today. They were Wilmington's first politicians. They fought at Lexington, Cambridge, and Bunker Hill, and they were even ranking officers during the Civil War. They still have descendants in Wilmington. The Bazell family are direct descendants of Henry Harden. And W.G. Harding, President of the United States from 1921 to 1923, is a direct descendant of Richard Harnden, the father of Richard Harnden, the first white man to settle Wilmington. No matter how small some people may say Wilmington is, it has a history that is just as interesting as anywhere else. It's a shame to think that some citizens of Wilmington pass by these places and often don't know their historical values. But more and more Wilmingtoners are beginning to take an interest in these places. I only hope that they will still be around for many more future generations to appreciate the historical importance of the Hardens of Wilmington.